Welcome to the discussion, Black Market Woes on Rainier Avenue Radio. I'd like to welcome you to this discussion again, and I'd like to thank Hempfest for engaging Rainier Avenue Radio in the presentation of this important conversation. The war on marijuana in black and white was a study that was done between 2000 and 2010, and this report reveals that the racist war on marijuana is far from over. More than 6 million arrests occurred between 2010 and 2018, and black people are still more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than white people in every state, including those that have legalized marijuana. I would like to welcome my guest to the show, and I will start with Aaron Barfield, who's the founder of Black Excellence in Cannabis. Aaron, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good to have you, Aaron. Aaron is fighting for inclusion for African Americans in the economic opportunities created by cannabis legalization. With operational experience both as a medical provider and managing partner of Emerald Haze in Renton, Washington, a recreational cannabis store near Seattle, navigating a number of obstacles to obtain a retail cannabis license in 2014. By the end of his tenure as managing partner, he had taken Emerald Haze from a business plan to a multi-million-dollar company and the #1 store in the city. Aaron has a deep love and appreciation for the cannabis plant and believes those who fought and sacrificed to build the foundation for the multi-billion-dollar cannabis industry that we have today must be included in the economic rewards of legalization. Aaron, great to have you here. Also joining me on the show is Maur Stringer. Maur, how are you?
Awesome. How you doing, man?
Great, and great to have you. Maur is coming to us from Boston, correct?
Yes.
Maur is a father, husband, and orator. Maur is a self-identified soldier in a war waged against him before he was even born. Abducted by police at the age of 13 and charged as an adult for marijuana at the age of 14. Maur is the author of M.A. Jumping Jim Crow for Cannabis, a historical account on how the war on drugs, which really was the war on marijuana, waged against black and brown Americans, continues to ensue in the 21st century despite the decriminalization of marijuana. From A1 felony charges to the struggles of attempting to benefit from Massachusetts' social equity marijuana program and enter the legal cannabis market. His narrative will give you a new lens to an often shared data point. The war on drugs and its effects continue to negatively impact black and brown people at grossly disproportionate rates, despite the legalization and decriminalization of marijuana. And Maur, look forward to hearing your story again. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Also joining us is Cynthia Mompoint. Cynthia, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Cynthia is a career educator, leader, evaluator, and businesswoman. She's the operator and director for her family-owned real estate brokerage in Massachusetts. She also owns and operates a consulting firm, the Donbala Group. Did I pronounce that correctly, Cynthia?
Yes, the Donbala Group.
Cynthia has written and produced the M.A. Marijuana Social Equity Report, analyzing Massachusetts cannabis equity programs after 2 years of implementation, and created the PIES program, a structured positive impact program that aligns with M.A.'s cannabis equity goals. Cynthia is a strong advocate for cannabis social equity, empowerment, and education. She's also the wife of Maur and mother to their 3 children. And also joining us is Howard Smith from Elements Media Networks. Howard, are you there with me?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, and Howard, I'll tell you what. Why don't you? I'll tell you what. Howard has been in the entertainment industry for 20 years, starting as manager and producer, and helped develop some of the careers of many writers and producers in the east and west parts of the country while working under the Gamble and Huff family of producers from 1999 to 2003. After leaving for college, Howard and his music partners started their very own management company and record label via a joint umbrella company. All three would sign a production deal with Sunset Records, which would last till 2006. In 2012, Howard disbanded his record label to work more in TV and film, and mobile app exclusively with startup Roku. After developing Elements Media Networks Broadcasting, Howard began writing and producing original content and helping the next great actors, writers, and filmmakers. Howard, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, let's go ahead and get started. Aaron, I'm going to start with you and Black Excellence in Cannabis and what you've been doing. Can you relate to us your story and why you became an advocate, and something that I'm quite aware of in the state of Washington, which are the barriers and the maze of things that were put in place that prevented African Americans and blacks from participating in the legal marijuana industry in the state of Washington?
Well, in Washington, you know, the cannabis industry is just one of many industries that we've been locked out of. You know, I've come to find out in my fight for inclusion, really, this is, you know, it's pervasive, and, you know, across a broad spectrum of economic opportunities that we're blocked from. What the biggest travesty with cannabis is that we actually did have a share of the cannabis industry here in Washington. There were, you know, quite a few Black-owned medical cannabis dispensaries before the recreational regulation came in and, you know, basically did a hostile takeover of an industry which we built. So Black Excellence in Cannabis was formed by mainly members who were pioneers from the medical cannabis industry, had their own medical dispensary or medical collective, and were since locked out of the industry by the Washington Liquor and Cannabis Board.
Now, and I've said this, and I said it in the intro, and you're saying it again, locked out. And people may not necessarily understand what that means and how that happens. Go into a little more depth when you say locked out. How was the Black cannabis industry essentially locked out by Washington State?
Well, they used, you know, various means to actually do it, but locked out means basically a system of apartheid that they created here in Washington. Of the 48 cannabis stores in the city of Seattle, none of them are Black owned. You know, that licensing process, they began issuing licenses for the city of Seattle in 2014. And, you know, we're here in 2020, and that still remains true. There are 0 Black-owned stores in all of Seattle. The regulated industry, less than 1% is Black-owned across the board in the entire state. And that is in a state where, you know, as you mentioned before, we are arrested at 4 times the rate of white people for cannabis. So it's awfully ironic that they were able to find us when they wanted to lock us up for cannabis, but when it's time to reap the rewards and benefit from the economic opportunities created, then they're mysteriously unable to find any Black people who qualify.
And there was this thing called House Bill 2870, Aaron, which I want to talk to you about in a little bit and get your feedback on that the governor signed on March 31st, that was supposed to essentially have set-asides for licenses for, what did they call that, in communities that had been impacted by the war on drugs or something like that. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Aaron, I want to bring on my other guests on Maur. Let's hear your story. As I mentioned earlier, arrested at the age of 13. Let's hear your story, Maur.
Well, I was abducted at the age of 13. That was my first encounter with police. I was kept and I was interrogated for over 12 hours. me and a group of friends without our parents there. But present day, our story is my wife and I were in the equity program, and it was a farce. It was a farce. Just like the language you use, they just said from communities that were disproportionately harmed. Somehow that has translated in Massachusetts to white people. There's white people in the equity program, and it's not a knock on the white people in the equity. I know some of the white people in the equity program. It's America. We're opportunists. It's capitalism. So it's the state who betrayed us with the language. They created language, and they're creating language in all these other states that is allowing it to be exploited. And that's exactly what happened in Massachusetts. And not only were there white people in our equity programs, the first 3 years of equity, all of the licenses went to out-of-state operators. Over 100 plus out-of-state operators flooded our market. My wife and I, she wrote about it in the Massachusetts Marijuana Social Equity Report. Oh, well, not in that report. She wrote about some of the effects of it, but we didn't clearly want to call out names in the first report. But as we went on, we had to start calling out some of the people who were involved. But we see the same people, Forefront Ventures. We see Chris Crane. We see him in Illinois. We see him in California. We see these individuals in different states, and I'm sure you see the same thing where you're at. Multi-state operators working their way on the legislation, working their way into the legislative bodies. In our state, Massachusetts, we have a corporation who put their corporate person on the Cannabis Control Commission. This is the commission that's in charge of doling out licenses. So Forefront Ventures put their corporate person on, and it's textbook espionage, economic espionage. If you check that out, what they do is they co-opt these college students. They create these activist groups that are branched off of these college students. In this case, it's SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, ran by Chris Crane. It's an international activist group, and they go around in these different states and they create these other sub-activist groups. In our case, Massachusetts, it was MRCC. This was a state-funded activist group who they unleashed on the public. These were the most aggressive people out there. They were in charge of these college students are in charge of, quote unquote, legalizing the state. And then once these college students, quote unquote, legalize the state, they have the power of we can push the market however they want. And that's what they do, and then one of SSDP's students and Chris Crane's students made their way onto the Cannabis Control Commission. And how do they do that? Because the local states are in collusion with these bodies and these entities coming in. And they're all, in our case, and I think in your case also, they were fanning the flames of equity in Black people. We want to legalize because we want Black people to get a chance. We want this to stop happening to Black people.
The war on drugs is horrible. Prohibition has been damaging.
Cynthia, I'm bringing you now. Thank you, Maur. I just want to make sure. So Cynthia, Mompoint, again, your husband. Cynthia, go ahead and give us your intro, your take on what this conversation is about and what's happening now.
Yeah, so I think both Maur and Aaron have done a great job highlighting the role that the key actors who are playing in what we see. And one of the things I'd like to add is the fact that, and Maur started to allude to this, is all of the entities, and you see this across the country right now, specifically given the current climate, they use the narrative around the harms that the war on drugs had on our communities of color. And they wave that flag as reasons why we should all mobilize and push and support for legalization. However, what we've seen happen, and it continues to happen, and it's going to continue to happen time and time again if we do not insert ourselves in a more aggressive leadership role, is they use that, and folks will show up and vote and push for legalization in their state. But then the businesses that get to open up the opportunities are literally handed over to white and wealthy business owners and operators. And what was really specific and unique here in Massachusetts is that Massachusetts wrote social equity. They wrote their equity provisions into the legislation. And so legally, we have standing. However, the way that the regulatory body, which is the Cannabis Control Commission that Maur has mentioned, the way that they have regulated and interpreted, and that legislation has been to the detriment of Black and brown communities and Black and brown business owners entering into this industry in numerous capacities. Very quickly, when they talk about the way that they define communities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, they no longer define it by the same populations that we know when we're talking about statistics. We're saying Black and brown men, Black and brown people have been disproportionately harmed, but in Massachusetts, they talk about communities, and with gentrification, with the numbers in terms of, they look at the arrests for that particular community. Well, if you're traveling to another community as a Black individual and you're arrested in that community, that arrest is counted there. And so for that community, it appears as though it's disproportionate. Now this community is deemed a disproportionately impacted community, and they can receive equity benefits. However, the population of that specific community does not reflect the very population who's been impacted. So it's little details like that where there's a disconnect, and you see across the country people saying that, well, we thought it was going to reach our people. We thought it was going to reach our communities. And that's not exactly what's happening. They push the rhetoric, but the actual paperwork, the decision makers, all of that's coming out, we see through the data, through the outcomes, it's not coming to our communities. It's not coming. They're not allowing us to enter into this industry fairly.
This is a wonderful explanation that all of you giving. When I alluded to first, when I first started this conversation, the maze that has to be gone through, which requires money, which requires lawyers. And I want to bring to this conversation Howard Smith from Element Media Networks, talking about a media network. Howard, and let's share why you are engaged in this conversation about Black market woes and the discrimination and barriers put in place that are preventing African Americans from participating in the legal marijuana industry.
So I'm gonna give you a little synopsis. So we're struggling to get it legalized here in the East Coast. So just like you guys know, Philadelphia, New York, New Jersey, DC, African-American males are locked up for a little bit of just marijuana and they're getting football numbers and crimes and things like that. So when I advocate a few other gentlemen that came home for doing 15, 20 years for $400 worth of weed, locked up 17 years, wanted to get to the legal marijuana business. So we created a coalition of investors. We decided to go to the West Coast and places where it was legal to create the legal businesses for these gentlemen. So we did that. It took us a few years to do that. We were out here in New York, going to city council, trying to advocate to legalize it here, to free the people that are in jail for little amounts of weed, but getting life and convictions that murderers would get for a little bit of marijuana. So what we did was we put our money together, went to the states that were legal, decided to get into the business. But as we discovered, it's not that easy because there's not too many African-American, Black and brown people that have in those states and have that many businesses to be able to operate, and have businesses in those states that are legal. There's a lot of politics, and that's what we're going through right now. We're in San Diego trying to do it, and it's been hell of a time trying to do that there. So that's one reason why this is close to my heart, because I have tons of guys that work with me that are just getting out of jail, but and just for those little bit of numbers. But now that everything is being legalized, the playing field is not even for the African American, for the Black and the brown people.
In every state, let me say that again, every state, Black people are arrested at higher rates than white people for marijuana possession. It's it's no longer whether government resources should be redirected from prosecution of marijuana toward public health investments and community collaborations. They should be. When states legalize, how can they do this through a racial justice lens? There's no longer a question whether marijuana should be legalized. It should be. Whether is no longer a question about whether marijuana legalization is about racial equity. It is. it's no longer a question again about what government should do. What we do know is that when states legalize, how can they do this so that there is a racial justice lens to address the panoply of harms that have been selectively aimed at Black and Latino communities for decades? These harms, as Howard was just mentioning, include not only arrests and incarceration and lifelong criminal convictions, but also the loss of jobs, housing, financial aid eligibility, child custody, and a number more. Welcome to Rainier Avenue Radio, our discussion on Black market woes. And now we've been having a conversation that I'm going to just kind of call at the 30,000 foot level, which is necessary. And I'm glad that everyone is able to share this information. I want to bring this thing down to the street level a little bit. What we know for sure is now what is legal caused tremendous impact on our Black communities. And I want to discuss that. We had that pre-conversation. I want to go back beforehand and let's talk about the impact that marijuana, before it was decriminalized and before it was legal, from y'all's perspective, the impact that was being had on our communities. And anybody who'd like to can just go ahead and jump in right now.
Yeah, if I may start off the discussion on that. The first thing they need to do is America is acknowledging that they had a war against us. So this was a real war. This wasn't a fake war. This war was fueled with billions of dollars annually. This was a real war. This was a war that included in disenfranchising Black and brown folks from all industry. Black people control no industry in America. So it's not just the cannabis and the media, all industry. This was a war where white dominated TV from white supremacy. They got up on the TV and they told the public all types of smear campaigns about Black folks. So this is why they was able to charge me at 14 as an adult for marijuana, a Schedule I drug in New York, because they told the public we were predatory. This was in the 90s. So this was a full out campaign. So there needs to be a full out campaign to address and educate the public, myself included, because we don't even know that we are soldiers enlisted in this war, still enlisted in this
Maur, I'm losing your audio a little bit.
I'm there all day and they still locking us up all over America for the soldiers in this war.
There we go. There we go. Go ahead, Maur.
We were enlisted in this war. We didn't even know we were in. We were child soldiers. So this was a real war that was directed at our people. And the first thing they needed to do is educate everybody from both sides, police, everybody, regular citizens, that this was a war and it was done to Black people. It was a war that the government funded, and it's a war that you need to unfund or defund. And I always make the example, when we blew up Hiroshima, when we blew up Nagasaki, Japan, when we was in Afghanistan, when we tore up these countries, after we rebuilt, we were sending billions of dollars over there annually to rebuild bridges, rebuild homes, rebuild families. The mass incarceration is still going on, and that's the first thing they need to do with this thing, educate everybody.
Maur, I want to get some other folks to jump in on this conversation as well. I'm going to go just a little bit back here historically with Hearst newspapers when marijuana became a Schedule I drug, and it was essentially to arrest Black musicians and to arrest Mexicans. And the propaganda started back then. And I want to make sure that again we get some more conversation again on the harm that this has done and the systemic oppression that was created by marijuana when we get back from this break. We'll be back in a couple minutes right after this.
This is Paul Pearson, host of Star Time, and when I'm not busy tearing the roof off the suckers, I'm listening to RainierAvenueRadio.world.
What's on your heart? Are you exhausted at the lack of progress for people of color in business, politics, and life? This is Cindy Bright, the host of Heartbeat Radio. Each week, we explore this heart condition in the country that is affecting you and me. We have real conversations about what's necessary for change. It's time to change this dialogue. Will you join this heartbeat weekly, Wednesdays at 7 p.m. on Rainier Avenue Radio?
This is the news on Rainier Avenue Radio. State health officials are urging all Washingtonians to get a flu shot as soon as possible. The State Department said in regards to both the coronavirus and the flu, quote, the presence of both viruses could put more people in the hospital and strain Washington's healthcare system. While we don't yet have a vaccine to prevent COVID-19, we do have one to prevent the flu, unquote. Per patch.com, flu shots are encouraged for everyone aged 6 months or older, and especially for young children, pregnant women, seniors, and those with underlying health conditions, including asthma, neurological and neurodevelopment conditions, chronic lung disease, heart disease, blood disorders, endocrine disorders, kidney disorders, liver disorders, metabolic disorders, weakened immune systems due to disease or medication, people younger than 19 years of age who are receiving long-term aspirin therapy, and people with extreme obesity.
And that's your news on Rainier Avenue Radio. This is Karen Z with RainierAvenueRadio.world, and we want to hear from you. Our goal is to amplify and share the diverse voices of Southeast Seattle residents. Do you know of an engaged community member who should be featured in a community spotlight? Tell us about them. Do you know of an upcoming family-friendly, educational, or cultural event coming up? Tell us about it. If you have news to share, contact us by emailing RainierAvenueRadio.world@gmail.com. Once again, please email us at RainierAvenueRadio.world@gmail.com.
October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. If you or someone you know is a victim of domestic violence, please visit our website at www.RainierAvenueRadio.world for further information about resources and who you can contact regarding domestic violence. There is also a national domestic violence hotline, 1-800-799-7233. Again, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800-799-7233.
What up, y'all? DJ Dirty Harry hanging out with my guys at RainierAvenueRadio.world. Check them out.
Welcome back to Rainier Avenue Radio.world's discussion, Black Market Woes. We're having a discussion about, well, what comes down to discrimination and intentional barriers that prevent Black folks from getting in the legal marijuana industry, even though we were clearly hit the hardest by injustice and arrests that impacted our communities, our families, jobs, and yeah, I could go on and on. We're going to talk about this more. My guests joining me are Aaron Barfield from Black Excellence in Cannabis, Maur Stringer, and also Cynthia Mompoint, and Howard Smith. And so we're going to get back to this conversation. And Maur was just talking about some of the things that happened to him and that he sees. And so I mentioned that if you missed the first part of this conversation, there was wonderful explanation about the barriers and how this took place from all of our guests. But I want to take this kind of down to a street level and talk about how this came to be and what led to the place where, you know, there was more of an effort to say, okay, we have to legalize this drug. It is not only harming society, it's exponentially exasperating the problems in the Black community. So Cynthia, Aaron, Howard, let's talk about this again from your perspective on what marijuana arrests did in the Black community.
So I'll continue the conversation and just really hone in the point that when we talk about marijuana, cannabis, weed, whatever the term you want to use, the stigma that was created because of these arrests and you actually alluded to a point in terms of historically where it was to attack Black musicians and Mexicans. The reason why we use the term marijuana, that was part of the campaign, is because marijuana is the Spanish word for the cannabis plants. So we're talking about a plant that in the white community, in the professional community, the medical community, they refer to as cannabis. But then all of a sudden, there's a negative stigma that has been attached to the phrase, to the word marijuana. And that phrase, that word has been tied to the Black community. And we don't make the distinction between black and brown, because when this war was waged, they didn't make the distinction, in terms of the data and how the data was captured. Brown people were included in the black numbers. And so with this stigma, there was and it had an impact. Not only do we have the greater community looking at the black community as criminals, as heathens for utilizing this plant, but then even within the community, it created trauma, because now, families are being torn apart by this plant. Families were being impacted because someone was participating and engaging in a plant that was most likely used to address the trauma that they're already dealing with because of the way society is structured, because of the white supremacy that they were already under. And so that lays the foundation for, and it has not been addressed. It has not been redressed. It has not been, historically, we don't address it. And if we don't address the history and the foundation for why we are where we are now, we're not going to be able to address the problems that we have now. So going back to how we even developed this stigma around the plant, and that stigma created trauma for our communities, trauma for the people who use it, trauma for the families that are tied to it, and those who may want to participate now, and that trauma still exists, and so they shy away from the opportunity that's being presented now.
Aaron, Howard, you want to jump in on this?
Everything I'm hearing is 100% correct. Here in Washington, they definitely used law enforcement as a tool to, traumatize the Black community and, basically, keep themselves in a position of dominance. With cannabis, we were subject to, raids. They didn't have an official policy of stop and frisk here in Seattle, but they might as well have. There was, countless times back, in the 90s, you'd see young Black men on their knees on the sidewalk, with guns pointed at them. And all that stuff is traumatizing. Those of us who were brave enough to, take the risk to get into the cannabis industry as medical providers or operating medical collectives. We did so at great risk to our freedom. And, a lot of us were, subject to incarceration because of our involvement with cannabis. It's just a long history of that. The Washington State Patrol, actually had task force where they worked in conjunction with the Drug Enforcement Agency, the DEA, to take down medical cannabis dispensaries that were Black owned. It's a fact that's what they did. We, whether they want to call it the war on drugs or the war on Black people, the effect was the same.
Howard, you want to jump in on this and share again your knowledge, your experience, the information that you have about the impact? As again, some folks may not be aware of this. Everyone's not aware of what the impact this was on Black and brown communities, and in Washington State. And I wish I had the verbiage here correctly, but our judicial system acknowledged that there was racial injustice based on the police officers and the way that they would stop Black people as opposed to the way that they would stop white folks, and then the arrest that would happen, and this was happening in our communities, and they had to identify because the numbers showed that. Before we move on, Aaron, you want to jump in? Excuse me, Howard, you want to add some commentary?
I think he fell off.
Oh, okay. Howard isn't there. I wanted to look at, and this is specifically a Washington State thing, and then Maur and Cynthia, you can jump in on this too. More than 6 years after the state legalized the adult use of marijuana, Washington Governor Jay Inslee said that he was going to pardon thousands of people convicted of small-time possession charges. And on March 31st of this year, there was the passage of HB House Bill 2870, which essentially, again, was supposed to have some set-asides for legal licenses for, again, I don't know what the terminology that they use, communities that were disproportionately impacted by the injustice of marijuana. Aaron, you mentioned there are no Black-owned recreational pot stores in Seattle. Let's talk about HB 2870. What do you think about it, and what do you think the impact that it's going to have?
Unfortunately, I don't think much of it. It was legislation that was recommended by the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. We lobbied against it, because we did not believe that it was effective legislation. Basically, they're throwing out 34 licenses to be distributed amongst all protected class citizens. So those 34 licenses are not going to go to all Black people. They're going to go to basically anybody who's from a class that has been, can make an argument that they were disproportionately impacted, or that they were, from a protected class somehow. And that includes almost everybody, except for straight white men. And they can probably find a way to work themselves into it as well, just like they have been, across the board. In Washington, there is major, I don't want to call it conspiracy, but there's major opposition to making any kind of change to the monopoly that these people have put in place. They're very happy with the current situation that they have. They don't want to add any additional licenses to the mix, which would devalue their licenses. So the only option that we have, we're told, is to buy one of those licenses for millions of dollars, which is ridiculous when the license costs $1,250 to apply for, and they rightfully should have been ours in the first place.
How has this been redressed, or has it been redressed in Massachusetts?
Well, I mean, it's the same thing. The same thing that he's talking about that's happening over there. I mean, it's a daunting thing, It's only for a few people. It's classism.
Yeah. So one of the things that's interesting to hear is we have different structures, but the outcomes are still the same.
Yeah.
So here it is in Massachusetts. There isn't necessarily a limit on the number of licenses that can be issued across the state. But what they did do was put a limit on the number of licenses one entity can actually control for a particular type of business. What does that mean? If you came in and you could only have 3 retail operations and 3 cultivation operations and 3 product manufacturers. You cannot have more than 3 of the same license type. And so that was their way of trying to control and prevent monopolies. However, it still doesn't address and get at the need for full participation, particularly for those who have been harmed by the war on drugs, which is the language that we have in our legislation. That's what I just said is what we have in our legislation. It's still dominated by white male business owners.
It's almost like they see, what if they can get away with it in one state, they'll do it in another state. So in Massachusetts, cannabis equity is for everybody. It's also for straight white men. It's for everybody. It's for, everybody. And it's disgusting. But I say that it's because the root of it is education. The public thinks it's a handout for Black folks. So now you have everybody attacking that as a handout, but it's actually something that they owe us for what they're doing to us. So here it is. We have 97% white ownership in cannabis in Massachusetts, and they have white people in the equity program. You know, I think it's like 60% white people in the social equity program, right?
They haven't released, they actually, as Massachusetts prides itself on releasing public data, but they have not released the updated data. So with the first cohort of about 140 people, it was 60-40 with about 10% not identifying who they were. 60-40, 60 being minority.
60 minority.
Yeah, minority running, that includes Black, anyone who identifies as not white. So that was 60%, 40% identified as white, and then there was another 10% that didn't identify their race or ethnic background. And then we have now expanded our equity program to include another 285 people, but the state has not released the demographic data of who constitutes that. We see who are the people that are constantly being put forth in the public as being part of the program, and there are a lot of white people, you know, to say the least.
It's an unregulated market, so they're showing themselves to be the biggest crooks. Here it is, they've been arresting Black people and brown people for all these years, but as soon as it's an unregulated market, so all you see is thievery from state to state to state. You just see some massive thievery, and you see
thievery at the highest economic level with millions and millions of dollars taking control.
They're very sophisticated with it.
Mm-hmm. Which shines a light on another thing. We can't get our day in court. We've been denied our day in court. Black and brown people, we see it. We're trying to contest it, but we've been being denied our day in court.
You're listening to Black Market Woes on Rainier Avenue Radio.world. And again, thanks to Hempfest for presenting us with the opportunity to have this conversation on their network. And it's me, Tony B. My guests again from Boston, Maur Stringer and Cynthia Mompoint from Seattle, and Black Excellence in Cannabis, Aaron Barfield. As events unfolded of civil unrest, it was clear that America was in the midst of a long overdue reckoning with itself. Since 1619, when the first ships arrived on the coast of Virginia with enslaved Africans in chains, our country has long had to struggle to address the inequality and structural racism embedded within our public institutions, particularly within the criminal justice system, from slavery and the Civil War to the battles to end Jim Crow laws, to the marches for civil rights, to the protests against mass incarcerations, to the Black Lives Matter movement. Each generation of Americans has stepped up to take action to fight to end racial injustice. And as protests continue across the country to take place, more Americans are beginning to publicly demand action to end policies and practices that promote, enable, and drive systemic racial injustice. In these conversations, there needs to be a demand to end the war on drugs, or at a minimum, end marijuana criminalization and correct. I don't know how you can correct, legalizing marijuana, if this is going to solve the problems, if you don't also deal with the systemic oppression that has taken place that has led to this. And as we see, again, at the start of this, talking about how, and you've listened to this conversation, systemically excluded, barred, the barriers that have put in place because of the country that we live in. And still today, in every state, even states with legalized marijuana, Black people are still arrested at 4 times the amount of white folks. Before we move forward, because I do want to talk about what's being done, what y'all suggest to be done, and not only on the part, but yes, on the part of Black folks, but on white folks who call themselves allies in this too. Before we move on to that conversation, is there anything else you guys wanted to talk about regarding, again, the street level impact, the historic impact that this has had on our black and brown communities?
Just to say that there are countless Black people from the medical cannabis industry from Washington that were left out and had their livelihoods basically hijacked And as a consequence, you know, Seattle has become the third most gentrifying city in the nation. You know, there's consequences to you know, to this kind of conduct, and you know, it's unfortunately it's Black people who are bearing the burden of that.
Okay. What about going forward? What can be done? What are you suggesting? What's taking place now? Again, you know, one of the things that I mentioned, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, is you can't just say, okay, you know, we're going to give out a few licenses without dealing with the entire structure that's in place that has led us to the point that we are now. Even though marijuana, again, is legal, you're still ending up with more Black people in every state still being arrested more than white folks, even though we knew the use and even the selling of it illegally is still the same. But Black folks are arrested more. What can we do moving forward? You know, and I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Maur, on this one. What do you think?
Well, I mean, economics, one, you know, just like they hop from state to state to state, we can hop from state to state to state and help each other erect these social equity opportunities. Now that my wife and I know what it is, when they open it up in New York, when they do Georgia, we can hop to that state and say, okay, we're going to finance all of this, the Black and brown social equity folks with our funding. And this is what we do. How they cut you guys out of the market in the medical market, that's crazy. That's crazy. That's straight white supremacy. You know, that's white supremacy, that's bullying. And that's what they're doing all over the place. So we can't, you know, appeal to white folks and say, hey, be fair. We have to be smart enough, and we are. We have to be economical enough and resourceful enough, and we are. They say we spend $1 trillion every year, over $2 trillion every year, I believe. So we spend $2 trillion in this country annually. Our budget is more than other countries. You know, probably the top 10 countries, we have a strong budget, just the Black community themselves. So we have the economics. We don't know what's going on with the cannabis industry right now because that's by design, you know. So we're not abreast on it. At the same time, they're telling us it's legal. The arrest rate, not only are we being arrested at a greater number than white folks, we're being arrested at a greater number than when it was criminally illegal. Right now, during the legalization, the arrest rate increased in Colorado by 50%. The ACLU report said the arrest rate increased in Massachusetts by 50%. They designed a new marijuana task force to go after these arrests. And so we're getting arrested at a higher rate during legalization, and we're not allowed to participate.
Cynthia?
So I'm just going to jump right in because what some of the things that you said, and it triggered some thoughts. So one of the things right there in terms of as states are legalizing, one of the things we need to continue to push in our communication across the country
I'm sorry, Cynthia. I'm having that same audio issue.
Well, try to speak loud.
No, it's I don't know what it is. It was happening with Maur for a second, and then it just self-corrected. Try it again. I'm still having it. Let's see if we can get that to change. And Aaron, you want to jump in while we see where this issue is, and we can get Cynthia back in on the conversation about how do we move forward? What do we do?
Well, moving forward, what Black Excellence in Cannabis is doing is we're going to continue to lobby for effective legislation. We want to continue to link up with folks like Maur and Cynthia, and we can get effective change in what's going on. The biggest thing that we're working on right now is a federal lawsuit that we filed in the Washington D.C. District Court. We've named the governor as well as the Washington State Liquor Control Board and the U.S. Department of Justice and charged them basically with, well, on the Washington State side, we charged them with basically operating an illicit drug scheme and violating the civil rights of Black people to do so. And on the federal side, we charged the Department of Justice with allowing them to get away with it. You know, we've been fighting this so far since I believe it was June when we filed we initially filed, and they've been trying to get it thrown out ever since. We've been fighting multiple motions to dismiss on their side, and we've been successfully defending that. And hopefully we can continue to do so, and we'll get our day in court.
And again, and Cynthia, I hope you're back. I want to get everybody in on this because we've only got a few minutes left. Do you feel like this issue is getting the support from the Black community that it needs and deserves? Again, when the Black community is once again the most impacted by arrest, do you feel that this is on the radar of the Black community, that the Black community is supporting those members of its community who are trying to be engaged in the legal marijuana cannabis industry?
No, it's not getting the level of attention that it needs. And part of it, a lot of it has to do with when we are constantly distracted by the agenda that keeps pushing, that's being pushed forward. So while legalization is rolling out, we are still dealing with our children, our men, our women being killed in the streets, being killed in their sleep. We are still dealing with the disproportionate impacts of the health crisis and so forth. So we have all of these things distracting, very important. And I say the word distracting, maybe it's more so engaging us fully. And then the community as a whole, we have a generation of people who are still dealing with the trauma and the stigma. And so to say to them, here is this opportunity, and for them to wrap their mind around, wait a minute, we should be making this a priority. And this is the same plant that had, resulted in their children being arrested, their children losing out on opportunities, their husbands being pulled away from their homes, families being destroyed, all of the collateral consequences of the war on our Black people for their participation in cannabis. That generation is a lot. They're the ones who are doing a lot of the involvement right now in legislation. So we have to look to the younger generation, bring them in to help push this conversation. And to the point that you're at around the question that you're asking, when we go to have legalization, we need to also be pushing that the current laws in that state around marijuana are removed, because as long as the current laws exist, then we're going to continue to see the disparity, because now the police still have grounds to arrest. It gives them more discretion as to who they arrest, what they charge them for, how they charge them, and so forth. So until we ensure that not only legalization is happening where businesses can make money from this, but also that people are not penalized in any way for their participation and engagement with the plant.
Wow. Cynthia Mompoint from Boston. You know what? We're almost out of time here. And so, Aaron, you suggested that we should do this on a regular basis. I think I'm going to take your suggestion, and I'm going to hold you all accountable to joining me so we can continue. Not that I think that I have to do that. I'm sure that you would jump at the opportunity to continue to share this information. We're almost out of time. Cynthia, I think that was a great point that we're going to have to extrapolate on in a future show. Yeah. I want to give each of you, you're only going to have about 30 seconds to a minute here for final words. And, Aaron, why don't we start with you? You started off the show. Just quickly, anything that you would like somebody to know about what you're going through or about this conversation, about 30 seconds to a minute.
Well, Tony, I just wanted to thank you for, making this platform available. I think it's crucial that we continue to shed light on what's going on so that, we can attract the attention from the Black community and the community at large to, to right the wrongs that are going on here.
All right, thanks, Aaron. And Maur.
Yeah, I just want to say, any lawyers out there interested, get at us. If you want to hear more about what we got going on, massmothermary.com. We also want to extend our services. We've done a lot of investigative work, all the investigative work, uncovering a lot of these things, reading the legislation, interpreting the legislation, demanding that the state municipalities do what's in the legislation. So we're at the services of the community at any other state. Our goal is to create cohesion between interstates.
Absolutely. And when massmothermary.com is a way to reach us directly, or massmothermary@gmail.com. I don't know if there's an opportunity to spell that out, but one of the things I want to say, this is my message to people who identify themselves as allies and want to actually have an impact in addressing the war on drugs and its the impact that it's had subsequently for that and changing the narrative moving forward, is to partner up with those who are on the ground doing this work, reaching out to us, reaching out to people such as Aaron and Howard, who you had on earlier, to find out how they can support, whether it's legal support, access to people who are going to actually take charge in bringing this legal voice, economic, financial investment, supporting those who want to enter into the industry and launch businesses, and continuing to support the communication that we're having here, and making sure that the message that you've and the platform that you've established here gets out to the community at large, both Black and white and everyone in between, because we all play a role in ensuring that the effects of the war on drugs are addressed properly.
You are listening to Rainier Avenue Radio.world. It's me, your host, Tony B. We've been talking about the systemic barriers that existed and still continue to exist that are keeping Black folks out of the legal marijuana industry, thanks to Hempfest again. And thanks to Howard Smith of Elements Media Networks, who joined us from Philadelphia. Thanks to Maur Stringer joining us from Boston. His wife, Cynthia Mompoint, joining us from Boston.
And the land is dark.